The rock bottom salvation of Charles Spurgeon for preaching month after month in and out of depression was the sovereignty of God. That God was over it, in it, turning it, controlling it, assigning it, designing it. He never lost that faith. He could always say that, no matter how black it was, he could at least confess that.
If you are listening to this episode, chances are you've struggled either with depression yourself or you know someone close to you who has. In this episode of Light and Truth, John Piper finds rich encouragement by considering how Charles Spurgeon himself navigated his lifelong battle with depression. This talk was originally given at the Desiring God 1995 Conference for Pastors.
The adversity of depression. It's not easy for me, I don't know if it is for you, to imagine the omnicompetent, eloquent, brilliant, full of energy, mighty Spurgeon weeping like a baby for no reason that he could think of. You ever done that? He said, "My spirits were sunken so low." This was age 24, 1858, the first serious bout with depression. "My spirits were sunken so low that I could weep by the hour like a child, and yet I knew not what I wept for." He wrote, "Causeless depression cannot be reasoned with, nor can David's harp charm it away by sweet discoursings. You may as well fight with the mist as with the shapeless, undefinable, yet all-beclouding hopelessness. The iron bolt which so mysteriously fastens the door of hope and holds our spirits in gloomy prison needs a heavenly hand to push it back." He regarded his despondency or his depression as his worst feature. That's his phrase, worst feature. He said, "Despondency is not a virtue. I believe it is a vice. I am heartily ashamed of myself for falling into it, but I am sure there is no remedy for it like a holy faith in God." And yet, somehow, this man preached again and again and again until June 7, 1891, for the last time in the Metropolitan Tabernacle before he went off to Mentone, France, to try to recuperate where he died. Now the question then is, how did he persevere and preach through this adversity? And oh, how many are the strategies of grace. Number one, Spurgeon saw his depression as the design of God for the good of his ministry and for the glory of Christ. In other words, the rock bottom salvation of Charles Spurgeon for preaching month after month in and out of depression was the sovereignty of God. That God was over it, in it, turning it, controlling it, assigning it, designing it. He never lost that faith. He could always say that, no matter how black it was, he could at least confess that. Listen to these words, which are so out of step with the way contemporary man and even contemporary evangelicalism attempts to solve its problems of adversity. He said, "It would be a very sharp and trying experience to me to think I have an affliction which God never sent me." Turn the world upside down, Spurgeon. Continuing that sentence, that the bitter cup was never filled by his hand, that my trials were never measured out by him, nor sent to me by his arrangement of their weight and quantity. What kept him going was the absolute confidence that every blackness over his soul was a cloud sent by the living God. I hope that you will hold fast to this vision of God and beware of new paradigms being offered you today, who think not only does He not control the future, He doesn't even know what's coming. And the review in Christianity Today 2 issues ago, the title over Doug Kelly's article was very perceptive. Afraid of infinity. Mark you, that is what is epidemic today. Afraid of infinity. Spurgeon was not afraid. This was his life. If God is not God over my depression, what shall I do? It is not the sovereignty of God for Spurgeon, the absolute control of all events, even the most horrible gout pain. If that is not controlled and ruled and assigned and appointed by a heavenly physician who knows and loves, then it's not something to be debated, but there's just no survival. The doctrine of God's sovereignty is not first debate for Spurgeon, it's a means of survival. Our afflictions are the health regimen of an infinitely wise physician. He told his students this: I dare say the greatest earthly blessing that God can give to any of us is health, with the exception of sickness. If some men that I know of could only be favored with a month of rheumatism, it would be God's grace to mellow them marvelously. And he meant that for himself, because he said, I'm afraid that all the grace that I have got of my comfortable and easy times and happy hours might almost lie on a penny. But the good that I have received from my sorrows and pains and griefs is altogether incalculable. He saw 3 designs of God in his depression. Number 1, it functioned like the Apostle Paul's thorn of the flesh to keep him humble and to show that the power belongs to the Lord. He said, those who are honored of their Lord in public, and he was honored and he knew he was honored. He knew he had the biggest church in the world. He knew he was eloquent. He knew his books were selling by the millions. He knew he could make as much money as he wanted. He knew God had honored him. Those who are honored of the Lord in public have usually to endure a secret chastening or to carry a peculiar cross, lest by any means they exalt themselves and fall into the snare of the devil. I think the same can be said of churches, probably. Second design of depression. It gave an unexpected power to his ministry. Listen to this story. And you all know stories like this from your own life, I'll bet. One Sabbath morning, I preached from the text, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And though I did not say so, yet I preached my own experience. I heard my own chains clank while I tried to preach to my fellow prisoners in the dark. But I could not tell why I was brought into such an awful horror of darkness for which I condemned myself. On the following Monday evening, a man came to see me who bore all the marks of despair upon his countenance. His hair seemed to stand upright. His eyes were ready to start from their sockets. He said to me after a little parleying, I never before in my life heard any man speak who seemed to know my heart. Mine is a terrible case, but on Sunday morning you painted me to the life and preached as if you had been inside my soul. By God's grace, I saved that man from suicide and led him into gospel light and liberty. But I know I could not have done it if I had not myself been confined in the dungeon in which he lay. I tell you the story, brethren, because you sometimes may not understand your own experience, and the perfect people may condemn you for having it. But what know they of God's servants? He said, I have learned that it is a prophetic signal for the future. Quote, this depression comes over me whenever the Lord is preparing a larger blessing for my ministry. The cloud is black before it breaks and overshadows before it yields its deluge of mercy. Depression has now become to me as a prophet in rough clothing, a John the Baptist heralding the nearer coming of my Lord's richer benison. So I would say on this first point that the sovereignty of God holding, controlling, designing the darkest of our days, corporately as a people, individually, family, are Joseph-like days in the dungeon just before you become the king of Egypt. Or Artaxerxes' days when the temple is shut down just before Darius not only revives the temple but says, and I'll pay for it. And I don't know what that'll look like in your life, but if you believe, number one, in Romans 8:28, and number two, in the sovereignty of God, that will carry you through. Number two, we're talking about Spurgeon's tactics of enduring adversity. Number two, with the theological survival strategy comes the natural means of survival that God has appointed in His providence in nature and in rest. You might wonder why I put this second, because I have more spiritual ones to come. I just put it second because it just seems so essential as I've counseled some of you and as I've taken stock of myself, and I'll try to explain. For all of his talk about spending and being spent and being burned up for the kingdom and laying down your life and dying early, nevertheless, he said, take a day off and keep the Sabbath in that way. He said, our Sabbath is a day of toil. And if we do not rest on some other day, we shall break down. Eric Hayden, who was the pastor of the tabernacle in the 50s, reminds us that Spurgeon, quote, kept when possible, I don't know what that word means, when possible, Wednesday as his day of rest. I don't know what makes it possible. More than that, Spurgeon said to his students, it is wisdom to take occasional furlough. In the long run, we shall do more by sometimes doing less. On, forever on, without recreation, may suit spirits emancipated from this heavy clay. But while we are in this tabernacle, we must every now and then cry, halt, and serve the Lord by holy inaction and consecrated leisure. Let no tender conscience, hear this now, let no tender conscience doubt the lawfulness of going out of the harness for a while. I can testify that 4 weeks extra that the church gave me last summer were precious and crucial beyond measure. So that when I came back, I could come back and I could go on. And I thank them, bless them for it. The press of duty, the foul air, the sedentary position, the season of fog in Minnesota, we would say February, March. Does this thing ever end? He confesses sedentary habits have tendency to create despondency, especially in the months of fog. And then he counsels, a mouthful of sea air or a stiff walk in the wind's face would not give grace to the soul, but it would yield oxygen to the body, which is next best. Which is perhaps why I put it next best. Let me just give you a personal word now. I am finishing my 15th year at Bethlehem. And I turned 49 this month. I have maintained some close watch over this body for the last decade, watching it and what happens here. And my soul, and the intertwining of my soul and my body. What I have noticed is that things are changing, have changed. Circumstances have changed. It's different to be the pastor of a church 15 years into it than the first 5 years. The atmosphere is totally different. You're no big deal after 15 years. When you're a big deal, you're new, everything clicks, nothing goes wrong. When you're no big deal and you're part of the furniture, then it's more realistic. Because everybody knows your flaws and they will tell you. So there are different circumstances, but I'm on nature right now. I'm on this body rest nature issue. I cannot eat today like I could eat at 34. I cannot. Unless I want to put on weight, which I regard as being a very bad stewardship of my energy and my heart and my life and my example. So you cannot keep going the way you were going. That's one change. Here's another more important one. In the last 8, I can't quite put my finger on it. You measure 8 to 7 years. I am far less emotionally resilient than I used to be. There were early days when I could work without any regard to sleep in my first 5, 6, 7 years here. And who cares about sleep? Good night. There are books to be written, and there are people to be talked to, and there's sermons to be prepared, and there are problems to be solved. One of my biggest theological problems is why God created sleep. You waste a third of your life unconscious like a dog. And that's close to heresy, because God did design it to teach us we're not God. I could do it. I could go, and it took no emotional toll. Check with Noel if that's true or not. I don't remember it having quite the same emotional toll. I got 3 hours sleep last night, just because that's the way I prepare for things like this. I know what I must do now, because I feel great now. The adrenaline is just coursing, and it's just terrific. But I've got a debt to pay to this body. And I'll better pay, or when somebody tells me that somebody's standing in front of the candles on Sunday, I might punch them. Worse than losing your control when you are tired is losing your future. My future disappears in proportion to how much sleep disappears. It is totally irrational, as far as I can tell, that loss of sleep would mean the future shuts down. That's just irrational. I deal with facts. Those are the facts, folks. That is a fact. And at 49, I reckon with facts. And that means go to bed if you want to survive the ministry. That's all it means. I could talk a big talk and say, stay up, burn candles at both ends, and I would be out of here. And I would choose to be out of here, because I would say, there's no hope for Bethlehem, there's no hope for Piper, I don't want to preach anymore, I can't decide anything anymore. Indecisiveness is another result of tiredness and depression. So I've got a debt to pay, and many of you have debts to pay. And I want you to pay them, brothers. Pay your debts to your body so that you have a future. It's irrational. I don't understand it, but it is there. Spurgeon said The condition of your body must be attended to. A little more common sense would be a great gain to some who are ultra-spiritual and attribute all their moods of feeling to some supernatural cause when the real reason lies nearer to hand. Okay, that's number 2. Nature, rest, pay attention to your aging, learn your body, and pay your debts. Number 3, Spurgeon consistently nourished his soul by communion with Christ through prayer and meditation. You know, it was a great mercy to me. How many of you here were here last year? You heard John Owen last year then. That was a great mercy to me to take up Owen. We were right in the middle of some horrid stuff while I was ministering Owen last year. And you remember I talked about communion with God, and I was just getting into it. That book, all year long, has been precious to me. Because communion with God is probably more important than what I just talked about in the body and the rest. None of these can be abandoned without devastation. But John Owen has been for me a place of refuge again and again, because I felt like when I was with him, I was with a rock. I was with a pillar. I was with somebody whose head was in heaven, whose feet were on the pillars of the deeps, who had seen the living God, who was opening him before me with a heart of affection for him. And I was just in the presence of the King's man. And when the atmosphere is not like that elsewhere, that's good. That's helpful. And Spurgeon said, never neglect your spiritual meals, or you will lack stamina and your spirits will sink. Live on the substantial doctrines of grace, and you will outlive and outwork those who delight in the pastry and syllabubs of modern thought. I think he made up that word, syllabubs of modern thought. I think one of the reasons Spurgeon is so rich in language, so full of doctrine, so strong in spirit, is that he read 6 books a week of Puritan theology. That is, he lived above himself, outside himself, and outside his century. He lived and coursed and fellowshiped and communed with God through what others saw of God. If you only read books published in this century, you, as C.S. Lewis taught us, starve yourself. He was immersed in great, great books. They gave him matter. They gave him language. They gave him perspective. They gave him God. Above all else, feed the flame with intimate fellowship with Christ. No man was ever cold in heart who lived with Jesus on such terms as John and Mary did of old. I never met with a half-hearted preacher who was much in communion with the Lord Jesus. One time he was in exquisite pain. He just was crying out, just screaming. And he said to the people, you must leave the room. And he went to his father, and the prayer he quoted was like a little child. If I had a son and he were screaming like I'm screaming, I would put my hand under his head and I would do everything I could to help him. I am your child. You are my father. Help me. And the pain lifted. He called them back in and he said, I think my father has heard me and that will not come back. He was a child at heart. This man was an amazingly childlike person in his relationship to the Lord. Communion with the Lord. Sustain it for the sake of your perseverance.
This is Light and Truth, God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. Thank you for listening. On our next episode, John Piper begins a 15-part series on God's providence with a talk titled, When God Sees. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.